selectors, and welcome back to the Life First Podcast. We're going to do some deep dives into some of these Tier 9 decks, a little bit of a refresher course, let's say, of it. And to start it off, we're going to start with actually the top 8 deck that I took to get to the top of the GP here, or at least not the top 8 of the GP, Tama Discard. I genuinely think that this is probably the best Tama deck out there right now, through a lot of testing. There's certainly some things here that I don't think are great and I would love to replace, but they have niche functions that I can't find uses for elsewhere. And so I have decided that this is what they've got to stick with. And I've got to be honest with you, every single matchup I played, I found use for every single one of these cards, and I knew what they intrinsically did, and pulled them out in the correct matchups to win. So I want to just go through this very briefly. So overall, if you've never seen the Tama Esper deck, or an Esper deck at all, welcome. This is going to be your new control deck that's going to be here for 3 or 4 more sets probably. It's incredibly powerful. What it does is, the idea is between Super Celestia Saber and Ultra Superheroes, you are able to have unparalleled filtering for your deck, and you're able to find anything you need, any bullets you need whatsoever. So it now becomes no longer a question of what cards do you need to win. The answer is just how much do you need of each card to hit the critical mass with the filtering that you have to win the game. You also have some other ways to bring back cards, not just Life Burst, but also Machina Smash, which, ironically, I use this ability less and less and less just because it costs enter, and I don't usually have it. That this is another way that you can bring back certain silver bullets. Overall, you are a control deck. Your job is to slow the game down to a halt using damage mitigation with, like, Madoka Clap, or, Wing Smash, these types of effects. As well as Signy that make it really hard for the opponent to just get on board, like Exia or Orochimaru. And you are then going to win via damage, right? And sometimes that damage will be 1 damage on the board and an Elrig swing. Sometimes it will be 2 Elrig swings from Tama. And that is, generally speaking, how you win the game. You also disrupt the opponent a little bit with a little bit of discard, but you'll notice that I have less discard than most Tama decks that you've seen, Esper Tama decks that you've seen in the past. And that is through a very serious reason. I know this says that it is discard. It is rarely used for discard. It is mostly used for opening a lane. So generally speaking, the only discard here is 4 Monomin, 3 Random Drain. That number could be 2, by the way, and it'd be perfectly fine, and 2 Bruno, and that's it. So I have less discard than most of the Esper decks do. I have filled that lanes with, instead, walls. So I used a lot of white walls. This one's a level 8,000 or 8,000 powered wall. This one's a 5,000 powered wall. This one's a 12,000 powered wall. This one's a 10,000 powered wall. This one's a 7,000 powered wall. All of these are very, very strong against the aggro decks, and you need this early damage mitigation stop, aka stop Ramels, stop Heras, stop Lancelots, stop Ogonas, to win against the aggro decks. Once you have walled up a bit against the aggro decks in the early game, you just smash them later down. You just need to make sure you hit them. Sometimes I even go so far as blowing not just my Madoka Float to draw cards, but I will also blow my Ultra Superheroes to draw cards to find 4 of these as soon as possible and play them. I couldn't fit more in there. If I could, I would have Mastema as sort of my concession to that. And then these aren't really good early game, but they're very good late game, and their Life Burst is pretty good. Overall, the deck is incredibly strong. You have a lot of also damage options here. The big ones are ZR, Phalaris, which will mill, so that stops 1 more damage. Orochimaru, which will be able to bounce for 1 damage. As well as, technically, Remember's ability to tax can be damage output for you. And those are the ways that you get damage across with this deck, aside from your main function, which is Tama. The difference between this Tama deck and the other Esper decks is that this basically has the damage built into it, so you're just supplementing some board damage with that. It is worth mentioning that Gabolg is really, really good, and I wish I could have had more than that, but it's just, they're so hard to fit all of these slots in here. If I could have cut a Phalaris for another Bulge, I would have, but often with this deck, you will mill the opponent down to 3 or 4 cards left in their deck, and you won't have enough with Phalaris you'll have to Phalaris them out in certain matchups. This is most relevant in the aggro decks because you'll have to win on a certain turn rather than let the aggro decks give you a chance to really kick your butt. So as such, you end up running the Phalaris as just sort of a quicker game ender, specifically against aggro decks. You don't pull it out against other control decks. Orochimaru is also really nice here in the fact that it can be removal, it can be a servant. It's not really great at either one of them, but the fact that it covers both options for you and you need that coverage in the deck is pretty good. You'll notice that I have an Ishikiri Maru in here, 2 of them actually, and this is a card that's almost like unheard of nowadays. It comes back from my Nova days. This was a card that was a strong 4 of in the Nova days, but it does the same job here. Basically, when I realized I was weak to aggro and I needed to shore that aggro matchup, I leaned on my experience of playing Nova and into white walls. Once I implemented that tech into the deck, everything came together. I had just enough disruption to punish my opponents that were playing tempo or control, and I had enough walls to stop, just full-on stop damage against the aggro decks. Buckler is a little bit of a strange inclusion here, but this Life Burst is literally worth it. You get it often enough, maybe 1 out of every 4 games, and every time you get it, it's incredibly strong. The deck lacks a lot of ways to push damage on the field, so I needed to make a conceit to have at least a little bit more, and I found just this Life Burst is just barely enough to get me there. The 3 Remembers were fantastic. I eventually cut all Coelas in this deck to have more Remembers. Coelas was another out against aggro decks, but the conceit I made to that was just running 4 Exias. I don't love running 4 Exias. 4 Exias felt like too much every game. I didn't need Exias, but every game I needed the Exias immediately, the 4 was the right number. So it ended up being kind of one of those, like, do what you can kind of deals. Bernices is a little bit of a filler for now. I think eventually I want to try something else. I did actually have Ogana in the slot for a little while and a little bit more black in the deck than not. I think I had 9 black cards in the deck overall. And it was actually pretty good. And I kind of, in retrospect, wish those were Oganas again, because it would have made my life easier in the top 8, being able to maybe open up some lanes there, but that didn't happen, and I'm not mad, because I did actually weather all of the... I played against a ton of decks that I felt the traditional Tama Esper deck is not super great at, and I narrowed that down to 50% even matchup, and then hopefully my player skill could take me the rest of the way. And I played enough of those decks in the GP that I'm like, yeah, I'm happy with every decision I made here. Inevitably, I'd want to evolve this when it eventually becomes the Remember deck in the future to something else. But I think if you played this list, you will always be pretty... If you are a skilled player and you know the ins and outs of the deck, you are able to levy these to really win. Like, for example, Bernices is there. It is a aggro blocking card, but I secretly pretend it's a level 2 in my head because I never play it early enough to get vanished against the aggro player. I will always look harder for the Tuyuki, and I need the white against the aggro anyways because it's a shorter game and I need the white enter. Whereas in the control matchup, I play these early on specifically because they're 3Ks, and I put them in front of things like Bruno's. So that way, in order for Bruno to do the discard, they have to vanish the Bernices, and then because of that, I mill them too, and that gets me closer to ending the game out with some mill. ZRs are really fantastic. Generally speaking, the fact that they can kill 8,000 or less is actually a really big game, but more importantly, they attack and get removed for free. So basically you can bait out assists with them, and if they don't play the assist, you end up paying the 1 enter and do the same amount of damage that you would have done if you did the extra attack with the Tama. But if they vanish it, then you still have the enter free to do the Tama stuff, and this deck is really tight on enter, so it ends up being a really important thing. If you're playing against this deck, the number one thing that I can suggest you to do to beat it, and I might be shooting myself in the foot by letting you all know this, is stop giving it enter. Don't give it enter. Just stop giving it enter. If you give it enter, I can convert that enter into cards that I need to win and damage to kill you. If you don't give me enter, I can't do that. I'm in struggle bus territory and I'm playing a fair game with you guys, and that's the easiest way to win in those scenarios. So try out that next time that you can get it. Remember that Yuki is a really, really cool card. It's only a 2 of here, but that's just because there's so many ways to find it again and snag it. I often will put Yuki in my trash, and so I'll have it for later, and then it becomes a silver bullet for later because it's just really good utility overall. All right, that's the Tama deck. I guess we'll also quickly talk about the Esper deck. Now, I should remind you that the Esper deck here is not the one that got top 8. I don't have access to that yet, but this is what I was playing against. Pigeon actually kind of showed me his deck a little bit beforehand, so I based this pretty heavily off of him, plus some changes I personally would make to the deck, and I think this is pretty close to what they ended up playing anyways. So the difference between this Esper deck and the other Esper deck is basically that you're running Madoka. Madoka has 2 abilities that make it much different, right? The first one is that you can bottom deck an opponent's Signy, which means that you can actually deal damage on the field, something that Tama doesn't necessarily do, which is usually a strength to Tama unless you play against Nova, and Nova has so much guard recursion that, that it's end up being, this would have been better for that. But the other part is also freezes your opponent's Elrig, which means that if you're in the mirroring Esper matchup, if you freeze Tama, that's really big game. It allows you to sort of force them to do an empty turn, and because of that, you end up winning the race just on that. The drawing a card and discarding a card doesn't seem like it would be very good. It's secretly great because often Ultra Superheroes misses a mill out by 4 or 5 cards, and the 4 or 5 turns that you have the Madoka out is enough with that draw and discard a card that you will make the opponent discard or mill out. The flip end is you will also mill out. You're always going to mill out with this deck against any Esper deck. Otherwise, this is almost exactly the same same kind of deck with a few notable differences. The big one is Firefly Squid. There's a much more heavier focus on discard for this Esper deck. You're in blue, it makes sense. You might as well discard more. Firefly Squid is an amazing way to snipe guards out of the mirror. The longer the game goes, the more chances that Firefly Squid's random discard will hit crucial pieces. So that's one of those things where when you see random discard, you're like, the longer the game goes, the better that is for me. It's a thing I learned in Pokemon, weirdly enough. You also are running... I don't know if this modem is really correct here anymore. It probably should be something else, but the mill does kind of matter here, and you do play a little bit more spells in this deck than you do the other decks. You're also going to play some amount of Oganas. Again, because you are lacking damage in the Elrig option as a repeatable form of damage, you need more damage on the field. Because of it, sometimes you're going to lean a little heavy on the discard, and hopefully your opponent will only be able to draw 2 cards and not fill out a complete lanes, and that will then help you push damage. But you need a little bit more damage in the field because of that. Because of that, there's stuff like Neon Tetra. Now, Neon Tetra is a strange choice here because it freezes your opponent's Signy. And freeze isn't removal, but it forces them to basically get rid of it their following turn, which means it supplements discard really well, surprisingly well. It's a very good complement, although it doesn't seem like it right away. In the same way that Gaybog is a really good complement to discard, because it forces things off the field. So inevitably, that is kind of how it works. Again, there's a little bit more damage in the main deck here. You got Animirage. This is another repeatable option because you can recur it through various options to get some extra damage in here. A little bit more card draw too, just because you need to replace the cards that you eventually discard. And another conceit to it, and I do not know if this was in the top 8 decks or not, but Pigeon was using it, and I was actually surprised by how good it is. It might be better as a 2 of. It shows up a little often as a 3 of, but I kind of like that it shows up a little often as a 3 of. Right is really, really good with Madoka because it basically turns Madoka into pay an extra enter that you have draw a card. And that is really good against aggro decks to search up guards, but it's also really good against the opposing mirror decks because this allows you to levy that to win the card advantage game. There was almost no time I ever played against Madoka with my Tama deck where I wasn't like, I'm going to eventually lose this card advantage game. I stopped focusing on discarding them specifically because of Right. Not that right stops discard, but right gives you extra cards in hand, thus you are more easily immune to discard, or recover from discard because of it. So I stopped focusing on discarding them down and instead letting them win the hand size war, and instead just focusing on my hand size, keeping my hand size afloat, and it ended up helping me out there. Overall, I think this is a better version of Esper if you're playing specifically against other control decks. I think it is a little weaker to aggro decks personally, but I can't make that claim until I really talk to Pigeon and Lance, who got top 8 with this, more about it. Maybe see what changes they made. I think it's a little weaker to aggro. I think it's a little better against the control matchups. Generally speaking, I think that's just slightly different Esper. You take which side you want, and then that is going to be the deck. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh yeah, playing against this. So they're going to always outhand you, basically, if you're playing against this with anything else. So what you should focus on is keeping your own hand size float, because that actually kind of makes Madoka awkward with its once-a-game ability. Another thing that in testing I found is actually really good against this deck specifically, that doesn't seem like it, is Exias. So the deck needs to open one lane a turn on the field, and it also has a ton of freeze. Exia just stops both of those things. Remember's also really good because Remember taxes a bunch of cool stuff in this deck, but Exia's actually just basically turned that damage race into horrible for this deck. So sticking an Exia out there and being able to keep it out for long, which is possible in this deck, generally speaking, the only way to remove that then is with a Gaybog or actually killing it with combat. If you have ways to recur your Exia, though, you can kind of get around that. And that is the Esper decks. We'll see what the Esper decks look like in the future once we get Remember.